since the beginning, she's different, Yael.
Yeah.
I don't know.
How would you
I
say?
don't know. It's just, I don't know. Even deep.
Okay. The lady told me recording in progress. Now, let's go one step further. The the reason when you defrost frozen food, frozen vegetables, frozen fruit, whatever it is, the reason that when you defrost it, it's not like really fresh that you buy in the market. The reason is that in the freezing process, water in every cell in the vegetable, living thing consists of cells. Cells are very complicated, but a lot of what is in each cell is water. When water freezes, it expands. There are reasons for this having to do with the crystal structure of ice. Water expands when it freezes. And therefore, what happens when you freeze a fruit, a vegetable, any food, when you freeze it, what happens is the cell walls break because the water expanded and broke the cell walls. When you defrost it, now the contents of the cell walls just flow out of the cells. And this is the same thing which happens when you cook. If you take fresh cabbage, it's crispy and crunchy, assuming that it's really fresh. Freeze it or cook it, and the texture changes very much. A fresh apple has one texture. Freeze it or cook it, two different ways of breaking the cell walls, and you're going to get a very different texture. Now, but as far as the nutritional value of the fruit is concerned, the nutritional value of the fresh fruit is preserved better in the frozen versions than you'll get in any market because there's a world of difference between freezing fresh produce from the field within 2.5 hours of harvest or getting it in the fresh food market the next day. From a nutritional point of view, it's like, but the texture is all wrong. If you're going to use the frozen fruit or the frozen vegetables for cooking, which anyway is going to break down the cell walls, so you won't notice the difference in the final food. As far as cabbage is concerned, what happens when cabbage, if you cook cabbage or freeze cabbage, the surface of the leaf becomes shiny and slippery. And therefore, as far as cabbage is concerned, if you freeze it, then simple rinsing will surely remove any insects which are there. As long as the cabbage is fresh, the insects might hold on to the leaf and not be just rinsed off. But once the leaf has been frozen, then the insects will just wash right off. If you want to cook the cabbage in any event, you don't want to eat it raw. You want to cook it in any event, then freezing it first requires just simple rinsing, and then you can proceed with your recipe to cook the cabbage. If you want to do this, what I do is you cut the cabbage, cut the head in quarters, remove the woody stem, the woody center, which you don't want, just cut that out, then freeze it. And after it's frozen, you just defrost it and rinse it off and cook it. In any event, we come now to the most important source, the Hagot Magoyot. We do not know his name, but we do know that he was a disciple of the Maharama Rothenberg. Now, I chose this source because this is the source which is later quoted. He's from the High Middle Ages, but this is the source which is later quoted by the Beis Yosef, by the Shulchan Aruch. And once it's quoted by the Shulchan Aruch, it's copied over and over again by all the great subsequent poskim. This is the source of the idea. Here comes the idea. Minastam, Samchin al rov beitzim shein bem dam. Majority of eggs do not have blood in them. I suppose this could vary from place to place and time to time, but in general, that's true, that the majority of eggs, surely in Israel today, the majority of eggs do not have blood in them. Even if you buy brown eggs from a organic farm where many of them might have blood, it's not the majority. Well, assuming we're talking about the most common situation where the facts are in place, we rely upon that fact that the majority of eggs do not have blood in them. The majority are fine. Because of this, ma'asim b'chol yom, every day, anu ochlim beitzim tzluyot. Because of this, we eat hard-boiled eggs every day. Now, if you eat a hard-boiled egg, once you've boiled the egg, once you have a hard-boiled egg, it's no longer possible to check the egg for blood spots. Before you cook the egg, you can crack it open and it's liquidy and you could look at it in the glass. But once it's hard-boiled, you've lost the opportunity to check the egg for blood spots. And we eat hard-boiled eggs all the time, the Hagos Maimonides says. Af al pi she'enan yecholot libadek, even though there's no way to check them. This is the rule. As long as the majority of eggs are acceptable, free of blood spots, as long as that's true, as long as that fact is in place, then you are allowed to eat hard-boiled eggs even though they cannot be checked for blood spots. Majority determines the acceptability of eggs. But why then do we want to check the eggs before we fry them or scramble them? Well, why do we want to do that? Why bother? Since we know that the majority are kosher anyway. Lasot mem tavshil. Why do we bother checking the eggs if we're going to use the eggs in a recipe, baking or cooking or whatever? Well, why do we crack open the eggs and check them before we use them in a recipe? Chumrah ba'almi. It's stam a chumrah. It's not halachically required, but it's something we do as a chumrah above and beyond what halacha requires. V'chein katav Rashba. The Rashba says this. V'chein b'Tosfos. Tosfos also says this. The Rosh also says it's the Hagot Maimoniot, which collects together all of these sources. They all wrote. Ma'asim b'chol yom she'anu ochlim beitzim megulgalot. They all say, a lot of sources say, we eat every day hard-boiled eggs. Af al pi she'ein yecholil libadek, even though it's impossible to check them. So the chiyuv b'dika, the obligation to check, depends upon majority. At time where the majority of eggs have blood spots, which I suppose is possible, in a place and time where the majority of eggs have blood in them, then there's a chiyuv, an obligation to check the eggs before eating them, and hard-boiled eggs will be prohibited. In a place and time which is more normal, namely, the majority of eggs are fine, there is no chiyuv b'dika. There is no obligation to check the eggs. If it's convenient to do so, because you're opening the egg anyway, cracking the egg open anyway, you might as well look at what you're doing. As many of the Acharonim say, we have, our kitchens have artificial light in them. Back in those days, if you're cooking at night, you're cooking in the dark. I mean, you have a candle going in your kitchen, but you don't see very much with a candle. I mean, you're really cooking in the dark at night. And so back in those days, the poskim say, if you're making scrambled eggs during the day, you're cracking the egg open, you might as well look at what you're doing. That would be a chumrah ba'alma. Why not look at if, on the other hand, you're making scrambled eggs at night, where it's hard to see what you're doing, and you'd have to light more candles. It's just not simple to do the bedika. Well, there really is no obligation. There's never any obligation. But if you're cracking the eggs open anyway, and there's plenty of light, why not just look at what you are doing? That is the halacha of eggs, and that illustrates the fundamental halacha governing the obligation of inspection. When is there an obligation of inspection? If a majority is infested, if a majority has blood in it, if a majority is prohibited, then each individual item requires examination. If it's a simple thing to examine the fruit, the vegetable, the egg, whatever it is, while you're preparing, you might as well look at what you're doing. And if you happen to see something prohibited, so you'll remove it. But there's no obligation to do so. It all depends upon majority. Now, this idea of the Hagot Mamoniyot from the High Middle Ages, and he quotes all the sources, becomes the opinion of the Ramah in the Shulchan Aruch. His words are, if you're making scrambled eggs during the day, it would be correct to look at what you're doing, and if you see a blood spot, remove it. But at night, where it's hard to see what you're doing, or b'diavad, if you failed to look at what you're doing, you're looking somewhere else while you're cracking the eggs open, you're not even looking at what you're doing, b'diavad, ein lachush, no problem at all, because there's no chiyuv b'dika. Now, I will explain to you the underlying concept. Where there is a chiyuv b'dika, where there is an obligation to check, it follows that there is also a prohibition to eat. Something which you're obligated to check, you're not allowed to eat. It is the examination which then permits eating that food. In a place and time where the majority of eggs are prohibited, you are not allowed to eat any egg. There's a prohibition to eat the eggs until you perform the inspection and the bedika. The inspection then permits the egg to be eaten. Now we have to know how well the bedika has to be done. How carefully must the inspection be done? Different people have different standards. Some people might take 5 minutes to check a head of lettuce. Other people might take half an hour with a light table. What defines the minimum requirement of bedika, the minimum requirement of examination? Here the Shulchan Aruch is perfectly clear. Shulchan Aruch says as follows: every Torah observant person must be considered reliable if that Torah observant person says, I checked it and I didn't find anything prohibited. I did not find any blood in the eggs. I did not find any insects in the food. Any Torah observant person is ne'aman, trustworthy, to say that it was checked and now the food is permitted, until such time as you find an insect so large that no one could have possibly overlooked it. If someone claims to have examined the rice, if someone claims to have examined the lettuce, whatever it is, and it claims that it's free of infestation, and then you find a snail, or that's the example of Shulchan Aruch, snail, something so large that no one could have possibly overlooked it, then that person loses his or her reliability as far as checking is concerned. But we have a presumption that every Torah observant person is ne'aman, trustworthy. If he or she says that the checking was done, then the food is permitted until we see something so large it could not possibly have been overlooked. Now, in the good old days, when all was right with the world, back in the Stadtlach in Eastern Europe, where they had neither running water nor electricity, and the vegetables were delivered from the farm outside the village into the village with a donkey cart. Back in the good old days, of course, the majority of everything was infested. And therefore everything required examination. In modern agriculture, with all of its faults, I mean, there's a lot to fault in modern agriculture, but at least the infestation problem has in large measure been resolved, and many things which in earlier generations were always infested, nowadays are rarely infested. Rarely means less than 50%. In a previous Gilgul of mine, I used to be a Hebrew teacher. Hard to believe, I know, but it's true. Shalom, mashlomcha. Back when I first got my first job as a Hebrew teacher, there was a reception for all the new teachers in the university. All the new professors were invited to a reception, and I went, and I found myself in a conversation with a newly hired professor in the Faculty of Agriculture. And I said, "Oh, agriculture, that's very interesting. What is your field of research?" And he said, "Oh, I do insecticides." I said, "Oh, insecticides, that's very interesting." And I asked him, I said, "Wouldn't it be healthier? Wouldn't it be better for us to eat foods which have not been subject to insecticide? Wouldn't it be better to not use insecticides? Wouldn't it be healthier?" To which he says, "Yes, of course, of course, of course, it would be much healthier to to prohibit all insecticides. But then you would have to decide which third of the human population to feed." Um, well, uh, uh, much of what we have in the Torah world today, requiring inspection of this, inspection of that, much of what we have is because our grandmothers and great-grandmothers did this when they lived in villages in Iraq or Poland or Morocco or Lithuania, where truly just about everything was heavily infested. It's not always true anymore. And therefore, according to the sources we see on the screen, which are the principal sources, the Shulchan Aruch, not surprisingly, paskins exactly like this. Beitzim muzarot. Well, we'll come to the text of Shulchan Aruch in a moment. As long as the majority of eggs, the majority of this kind of vegetable, the majority of that kind of fruit, as long as it varies from time to time and from season to season, as long as the majority in the market is not infested, there is no chiyuv obligation. You might as well look at what you're eating, or if you're preparing the food, you might as well look at what you're preparing. If you happen to notice anything, you'll take it out, but there's no chiyuv, no obligation to examine, and therefore the food is simply permitted. Okay, now let's turn to the Shulchan Aruch. Shulchan Aruch talks about beitzim muzarot, literally strange eggs. These beitzim muzarot, as Rashi explains and the Tur explains, einam mizachar. These are eggs which were laid by chickens where there were no roosters around. In the modern chicken coop, there are no visiting hours for roosters. And therefore, we know for sure that the eggs are not fertilized. In the good old days, where in the courtyard of the house, they were raising a few chickens, and the housewife would walk out with her apron full of grains and sprinkle grains in the courtyard, and the chickens would all eat them. Well, if you've got a rooster around, then you have a reasonable probability that any given egg is going to be fertilized. A fertilized egg is entirely prohibited. The whole egg is prohibited, and you need 60 other eggs in the mixture in order for it to be bottled. An egg which is not fertilized, for example, if we know that there are no roosters around, which has a blood spot in it, it could be blood spot, even though it's not fertilized. It's the blood spot which is prohibited. And in the words of the Shulchan Aruch, mutar le'achol bilvad sheyizrok et adam, you remove the blood spot, the rest of the egg is permitted if it is not fertilized. And that's true of all of the battery hens nowadays, the hens which are in commercial chicken coops. As far as free range eggs are concerned, depends upon the farm. Most farms will not have roosters on the farm, even if it's a free range chicken, and therefore we know that there's no possibility of fertilization, and this halacha applies as well. I suppose some of the free range farms might indeed have roosters. Well, that has to be left to establish the facts regarding each individual farm. Okay, these are the ideas which I wanted to present today. I'm going to pause with this and ask you if you have any questions.
I noticed that it talked about allowing the was it the majority of, you were talking about at the end there, the majority of eggs do not have blood spots. But how does that square with the idea that devar chashuv on its own doesn't get batal from the rest?
Yeah, part of the definition of devar chashuv is that the whole davar must be prohibited. If you have kosher food, kosher chicken, which absorbed a little bit of treif taste, well, it's only the treif taste which is prohibited, not the whole chicken, and therefore the rule of davar chashuv doesn't apply. And in this case, it's only the blood spot which is prohibited and not the whole egg, and therefore the rule of davar chashuv doesn't apply unless the egg is fertilized, in which case the whole egg is prohibited. Why is the whole egg prohibited if it's fertilized? The embryo, which grows in the egg, the embryo which eventually develops into a fetus, which eventually develops into a chicken, the embryo begins as a cluster of cells, usually on the surface of the yolk. That's the best place for the embryo to develop. That's usually where it develops, but not necessarily. It begins as a cluster of cells, and to the naked eye, the embryo looks like a blood spot. A few days later, in the course of a few days, what the embryo does is it begins to extend microscopic blood vessels called capillaries, which begin to surround the yolk, and the embryo draws most of its nutrition from the yolk. In the course of a few days, those microscopic blood vessels called capillaries surrounding the yolk begin to thicken up, they grow, and soon become visible. And the whole structure of the egg, the whole substance of the egg is now suffused with blood. It just becomes visible after a few days, but those capillaries were there previously. They were just microscopic until they grew fat enough so you can see. So a fertilized egg, the whole egg is suffused with blood. The whole egg is prohibited. If it's a non-fertilized egg, for example, no roosters were allowed, then just the blood spot, which is prohibited, and the rest of the egg is permitted. So then let us pause with this. I wish you a good week and eventually a Shabbat Shalom, a safe week, and we'll continue next week. Until then, Shalom, Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom. Shalom.
Shalom.
Thank you.
You're welcome.